Hello friends, welcome back to our YouTube channel Doctor's Corner. In this today's lecture, we are going to discuss about one of the applied aspect in the respiratory physiology, high altitude physiology. Okay, so we are going to discuss in detail about this high altitude physiology. So from exam point of view, for first MBBS students appearing for the physiology exams, there are several questions related to this topic will be asked in the final theory exams. So we'll focus on that topics only. As an objectives of the today's lecture, we'll be discussing the most important topics which can be asked as a short note or a short essay for 5 marks or a 3 marks question. So first thing is about acclimatization. So what is this acclimatization? And all we are going to discuss. Then other topics related to this is acute mountain sickness, then chronic mountain sickness. Okay, so this 3 particular topics we are going to discuss if time permits, or else we'll just deal with the first topic, acclimatization, and we will discuss about these 2 topics in the next video. Okay, so before going in detail about these topics related to high altitude physiology, first we'll have a general discussion. What exactly is high altitude and what are the problems at high altitude and how our body will cope up with this problems, and what is the mechanism behind that. Basically we are going to discuss these things. First, coming to what exactly high altitude means. So let's see what are the classification of the high altitude. So in generally, high altitude means the height or the altitude above the sea level. As one ascends above the sea level, for example a mountain climber, okay, so when they ascend above the sea level, so that some changes takes place in the atmosphere also, that is the barometric pressure, and also related to partial pressure of the gases, and ultimately to the physiological changes in our body. Okay, so what are the different levels? So just have a general idea about above the sea level. As one ascends, what could be the height or what could be the altitude, or what is high altitude? So generally you can see few cities are situated above the sea level around 300 feet, 2,900 feet, but most importantly hill stations like Ooty and all, they are around 7,350 feet height above the sea level. Okay, similarly, so what is high altitude? So any altitude above, that is in between 4,000 feet to 11,500 feet, that is high altitude. Then there is something known as very high altitude and the extreme altitude. Very high altitude means from 11,500 to 18,000 feet. For example, Kedarnath and Leh is around 11,900 feet. Leh is around 11,900 feet above the sea level. Okay, so this when an individual ascends to such a high altitude, what will be the changes? So generally around 18,000 feet, a normal person can survive with some adjustment in their body at this altitude, but there is extremely high altitude above 18,000 feet or around 20,000 feet. It will be very difficult for a normal person to take breathing or survive at the this one. For example, Mount Everest is around the peak is around 29,000 feet. It is at the above the extreme high altitude. Okay, so without any external aid like oxygen and all, it is very difficult for a normal person to survive at that such a high altitude. Now question arises, why so? Why at high altitude a person will find difficulty to survive or stay there? So basic problem is the barometric pressure or the atmospheric pressure. You know, at the sea level, the barometric pressure or the atmospheric pressure is around 760 millimeter of mercury. Okay, at the sea level, total barometric pressure of the atmospheric pressure. So this pressure is exerted by the various mixture of the gases which is present in the atmosphere, mainly nitrogen, which constitute of 78%, oxygen 21%, carbon dioxide and other gases. Okay, so we'll concentrate on oxygen. So oxygen will constitute around 21% of this total barometric pressure. So if we take 21% of this 760 millimeter, it is roughly around 159 millimeter of mercury. So what is this 159 millimeter of mercury? It is the partial pressure of the oxygen. So according to the Dalton's law, so the total pressure exerted is equal to the sum of the individual partial pressure of the different gases. Okay, we are not going to go in detail about the Dalton's law at this time. Just remember this thing. So this total pressure is exerted by the partial pressure of the nitrogen, partial pressure of the carbon dioxide, partial pressure of the water vapor, or partial pressure of the oxygen, but we are considering now partial pressure of the oxygen. So in the atmosphere, the partial pressure of oxygen is around 1459 millimeter of mercury. The basic problem is, as one ascend above the sea level, this is at the sea level, so this barometric pressure decreases. So this barometric pressure decreases. How much it will decrease? Let's see this tabular column. So as one ascend up to 10,000 feet above the sea level, so instead of 760 millimeter which was at this sea level, so it will be 523 millimeter of mercury. That is total barometric pressure at 10,000 feet. It is around how much? 523 millimeter of mercury. So total barometric pressure, when it is reduced, obviously the partial pressure of the oxygen is also reduced. So instead of 159 millimeter, it will be 110 millimeter of mercury. Okay. Similarly, if we see, as one ascend up to 20,000 feet, so the barometric pressure is 349 millimeter of mercury, and the total partial pressure of the oxygen in the atmospheric air will be around 73 millimeter of mercury. Okay, now I hope you understood what is the problem. So the main problem is, as one ascend up above the sea level, the total barometric pressure will decrease, and in turn the partial pressure of the available oxygen in the atmosphere is decreased. Okay, so let's try to understand this by a schematic diagram. Okay, I'll just draw a rough line diagram of the lungs. Okay, I will just draw a rough line diagram of the lungs. Okay, trachea and the two major bronchus, right and left, so that we can try to understand the physiology related to this high altitude, what exactly will happen and how our body will compensate to this, and we'll do to our topics of acclimatization and the acute and chronic mountain sickness. Okay, now consider this. Okay, rough diagram of the right and left lung, and this is one alveolar pocket. Okay, just I'm showing only one alveolar pocket. Okay, now it's not an correct anatomical diagram, just for the sake of understanding. Now thing is, the partial pressure of the oxygen in the atmospheric air, just now we have discussed at the sea level. First we'll discuss at the sea level, then we'll discuss what happened at the high altitude normally. So it is around 159 millimeter of mercury, right? So with this partial pressure of the oxygen will enter inside the respiratory tract. Okay, while entering, this air will get humidified by the water vapor. So as this is getting humidified, the partial pressure of the oxygen gets decreased. Okay, from 159 it will decrease to here 143 or something like that. Finally, when it comes to the alveoli, it will become 104 millimeter of mercury. So the partial pressure of the oxygen at the alveolar level is 104 millimeter of mercury. Okay, it is around 104 millimeter in the level of the alveoli, right? Now after this, there is exchange of the gases taken place in the pulmonary circulation. Okay, it is pulmonary capillaries across the respiratory membrane. Then ultimately this oxygen will go to the systemic circulation via the pulmonary veins into the left side of the heart, that is the left atrium, and ultimately from the left atrium to left ventricle. Okay, left ventricle and left atrium, so the pulmonary veins. Okay, I'm just drawing a rough diagram, and from the left ventricle it will enter into the systemic circulation via the aorta and its branches. Okay, now the arterial blood oxygen level, that is the partial pressure of the oxygen here, it will be around 95 millimeter of mercury to 100 millimeter of mercury, or the oxygen saturation is around 97%. Okay, we can see here, see at the sea level, the atmospheric partial pressure of the oxygen is 159 millimeter of mercury, whereas in the alveoli it is 104 millimeter of mercury, and oxygen saturation, arterial oxygen saturation is around 97%. What do you mean by oxygen saturation? Generally we determine the saturation, SpO2 and all, with the help of the pulse oximeter or finger pulse oximeter. You might have seen that. So usually oxygen saturation means how much amount of the hemoglobin is saturated with the oxygen as compared to the total. For example, if there is 100% of the hemoglobin available, out of that how much oxygen, how much hemoglobin is binded with the oxygen, it is saturated. So generally it is 97% of the hemoglobin out of the total hemoglobin is saturated with the oxygen. Okay, that is the normal thing. So this is all about the normal thing at the sea level. So hope you know the differences. So see, the oxygen level at the atmosphere is 159 millimeter of mercury. When it comes to the lungs, it will be reduced to 104 in the alveoli. Why? Because here one more gas, water vapor, which constitute around 47 millimeter of mercury, that will get added, and ultimately the oxygen level, humidified air, here it will decrease, and finally when it goes to the arterial end, it will be around 95 to 100 millimeter of mercury. Okay, this is the normal thing. Now, what is the main problem at the high altitude? So the main problem at the high altitude is this partial pressure of the oxygen is less as one ascend up, okay, for 15,000 feet or 18,000 feet. So instead of 159 millimeter of mercury at around 20,000 feet, so 159, it will be around just 73 millimeter. Just imagine, less than half. So if the total oxygen is just 73 millimeter of mercury instead of 149, obviously the partial pressure of the oxygen in the alveoli is also reduced, then in the arterial blood is also reduced, right? So if the partial pressure or the oxygen level is reduced in our arterial blood, then it leads to the certain complications. So that's what we are going to discuss about this, what are the complications and how our body responds to do that. So we'll discuss the first topic of the today's lecture, that is the acclimatization. So what is this acclimatization? As I already said you, this can be a short note or 5 marks question in your university theory exams. Okay, many times this has been asked. So for definition is simply, it is the adjustment of your body or the physiological responses to the high altitude, or the adaptations of your body to the high altitude, known as acclimatization. In simple words, it is the adjustment of your body to high altitude. Some changes or takes place in our body, that changes or the adjustment when our body ascends to the high altitude is known as simply acclimatization or adjustment. Simply in one word, it is adjustment. Okay, now what are the changes, what are the adjustment that takes place at high altitude? Okay, so when someone ascend it, so what is the major problem? Partial pressure of the oxygen in the atmospheric air is reduced, and ultimately in the arterial blood it is less. So what will happen? First change what we've seen is, the most important is increase in the pulmonary ventilation. Increase in the pulmonary ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation. So to compensate that, this is a compensatory mechanism or adjustment, okay, to take that, to survive with that less amount of the oxygen which is available in the environment or the atmosphere. With that also we can survive. So some changes takes place. One is hyperventilation or increase in pulmonary ventilation. It is also known as hyperventilation. So what exactly this hyperventilation or increase in the pulmonary ventilation means? You know, the normal respiratory rate is around 12 to 16 times per minute, and normal tidal volume is around 500 ml. So respiratory rate means in 1 minute, inspiration and expiration, that is one cycle. So around 12 to 16 times the cycles will take place. Okay, and tidal volume means the amount of the air which normally we take inspire or expire, inhalation or exhalation per breath. Okay, it is around 500 ml. If there is increase in the respiratory rate as well as the tidal volume, that is the depth of the breathing, that is called as hyperventilation. That is, the respiratory rate will be increased, and even the tidal volume, that is instead of 500 ml, one will take more amount of the air inside and expel the more amount of the air. For example, it will take 1 liter or 2 liters of the air instead of 500 ml. This is called as hyperventilation. Okay, so generally initially it is around 1.6 times than the normal. Immediately when someone goes immediately, so immediate response is hyperventilation almost 1.5 times. Then if a person stays there for at high altitude for some 4 to 5 days or 1 week, then it will increases the hyperventilation, that or pulmonary ventilation increases to 5 times the normal. Okay, 5 times the normal means, suppose tidal volume is 500 ml, so it will increase to 500 into 5, it is 2500 ml of the air is taken as inspiration, and 2500 ml is taken out as expiration. So what is the mechanism, how your lungs will do this hyperventilation, what is the signals and all? So let's come back to the schematic diagram here. So it's actually not neat, please bear with me. try to understand it. Okay, this is, I'm just drawing a functional, I'm not drawing a artistic anatomical diagram here, just to understand the concepts of the physiology. See, so at high altitude, as I said you, there will be decrease in the oxygen level. Now, which part of our body senses the decrease in the oxygen content or the partial pressure of the oxygen in our body? It is sensed by peripheral chemoreceptors. Now, what is this peripheral chemoreceptor, where it is situated? I hope you know this. You might have studied in the regulation of respiration. Just to remind you, so this one from left ventricle, this arc of the aorta, and this, there are blood vessels here. I am again not going in detail of exact blood vessels, but there is a brachiocephalic trunk and the common carotid artery, which will bifurcate into external carotid artery and internal carotid artery. Okay, internal carotid artery. So there is right side as well as the left side. Okay, I'm just drawing a one common carotid artery, okay, as a schematic diagram. So now, at the bifurcation of this, there is one sensor which will sense the change in the oxygen level in the blood, that is the partial pressure of the oxygen when it is decreased, especially if it is less than 60 millimeter of mercury as compared to 95, it will detect very fast. So that sensor, it is called as carotid body. Okay, carotid body, which is present at the bifurcation of this carotid body. So carotid body is a peripheral chemoreceptor. Similarly, there is, and near the arc of the aorta, is one more that is known as aortic body. So this aortic body and the carotid bodies are the peripheral chemoreceptors. Okay, location I have already said you, and you might have also studied in the regulation of respiration. So they will sense the less amount of the oxygen which is there in the arterial blood. So once they sense this thing, they will send the signal to a respiratory centers. Okay, now you know where the respiratory centers are situated in our brain. Okay, again I am drawing a rough diagram of the brain and the brainstem mainly midbrain, pons and medulla. Okay, there is a pons and here pons and medulla, okay, which will continue downwards as the spinal cord. So you know, in the pons there are two respiratory centers, pneumotoxic center and the apneustic center. Again, I am not going to go in detail about this. And there are other respiratory centers in the medulla. So in the medulla there is ventral respiratory group of neurons and dorsal respiratory group of neurons. Okay, dorsal and ventral respiratory group of neurons, ventral respiratory group of neurons and dorsal respiratory group of neurons. So basically this dorsal respiratory group of neurons is consist of the inspiratory neurons, and ventral consists of both inspiratory as well as expiratory neurons are present here. So this one, so what they do is normally these neurons through the inspiratory ram, they continuously send the signal through the nerves or the action potential to the spinal cord, to the anterior horn cells of this segment, cervical segment, that is C2, C3 and C4. So which forms the phrenic nerve, okay, which forms the phrenic nerve, and that will supply the muscles, that is the diaphragm muscles. And also you know, on the this one, the thoracic cage, we have one more very important muscle, that is the intercostal muscles. External and internal intercostal muscles are there. Okay, so from this thoracic cage, that is from this spinal cord segment C2, C3 and C4, from the anterior horn cells, one nerve will originate and it will supply the diaphragm muscle, that is the phrenic nerve. Okay, similarly from this respiratory group of neurons in this segment T1 to T11, okay, they will send the signal through the intercostal nerves to the intercostal muscles for inspiration, mainly the internal intercostal muscles. Okay, so generally they will send the signal so that there is a inspiration as an active process, so it will take inspiration normally, the normal tidal volume and all. Okay, we have already discussed in the mechanics of breathing. Okay, I am not going to describe in detail. Now, when your peripheral chemoreceptor senses this, okay, when your peripheral chemoreceptors, that is the carotid bodies and the aortic bodies, senses the change in the oxygen level, it is the reduced oxygen level in your blood, they will send the signal through two important nerves. Okay, through carotid body, one nerve will come, that is the ninth cranial nerve. It will send the signal to this ventral and dorsal respiratory group of neurons. And similarly through the aortic body one nerve will come that will send the signal to this ventral and dorsal respiratory group of neuron, that is the 10th cranial nerve. Okay, that is the vagus nerve, this is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So from carotid body 9th and through aortic body 10th cranial nerve. Okay, so this is how the signal goes to the respiratory centers, and they will stimulate these respiratory centers so that the deep inspiration and deep expiration takes place, that is the hyperventilation occurs. So this is the mechanism of hyperventilation. So what is the mechanism of hyperventilation? It is mainly due to the peripheral chemoreceptors. They get stimulated at high altitude because of the, what is the stimulus? Low oxygen content, or the partial pressure of the low partial pressure of the oxygen in the arterial blood. Because of that, they get stimulated and they send the signal through this 9th and 10th cranial nerves to your respiratory centers in the medulla, and the medulla will send the signal to the concerned muscles to the spinal cord, and the deep breathing takes place. Okay, this is one mechanism. Also, in the central nervous system, near this respiratory center, there is something known as central chemoreceptors. Central chemoreceptors. These are the peripheral chemoreceptors, what we have discussed, carotid bodies and aortic bodies. So, central chemoreceptors, which are situated near this respiratory centers, chemoreceptors. So, they get activated by the partial pressure of the oxygen. So very much important stimulus for this is partial pressure of the oxygen. You know, partial pressure of the oxygen, that is the stimulus is partial pressure of the carbon dioxide. Okay, so the stimulus for this is carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide, what it will do is it will crosses the blood-brain barrier and enter the CSF. So in the CSF, carbon dioxide will combine with the water molecule with the help of one enzyme known as carbonic anhydrase, and it will form H2CO3. H2CO3, that is the carbonic acid. Okay, so this carbonic acid is, by one reversible reaction, it will be converted into H plus ions and bicarbonate ions. Now these H plus ion in the CSF, which is formed by the carbon dioxide level in the blood, is a powerful stimulant to the central chemoreceptors, whereas these central chemoreceptors then will stimulate these respiratory centers so that deep hyperventilation takes place. So hyperventilation is mainly due to the peripheral chemoreceptors by the low oxygen content, and also by the increase in the carbon dioxide level due to the action of proton, that is H plus, on the central chemoreceptors. There is increase in the stimulation of the respiratory center. This is normal mechanism. But during hyperventilation, when there is ventilation is more, the tidal volume is more, that is more amount of the oxygen is going inside as well as more amount of the carbon dioxide is going outside. So when you expel more amount of the carbon dioxide, so carbon dioxide level in the blood or body is reduced. So when the carbon dioxide level in the blood or the body is reduced, so if we consider this reaction, then the total H plus content in the CSF is also less. Okay, and other body tissues. So this total H plus, when it is reduced, then it will not stimulate, or in fact it will inhibit this central chemoreceptors. So on one side, peripheral chemoreceptors is stimulating the respiratory centers for hyperventilation, and because of the more expulsion of the carbon dioxide due to the hyperventilation, the central chemoreceptors are inhibited. Okay, but the drive from the peripheral chemoreceptors is stronger than this drive, so ultimately hyperventilation will be there, but the magnitude it is not as great. So this condition, because of the excess of expulsion of the carbon dioxide and hyperventilation, it leads to the loss of H plus ions, which will increases the pH of the blood, that is called as respiratory alkalosis. Now this problem will occur due to hyperventilation, alkalosis. Now to overcome this problem of the respiratory alkalosis, kidney will help out and it will excrete the bicarbonate ions by some mechanism we'll discuss in the renal system. Time being, just believe me, kidney will excrete more amount of the bicarbonate through the urine, and ultimately by this metabolic process the pH will come back to the normal, and because the pH or the H plus ions will come back to the normal, then it will once again stimulate this, and there is 5-fold increase in the pulmonary ventilation. So pulmonary ventilation is increased up to 5-fold. Okay, this is the first basic thing. So first thing is what will happen, initially immediately there is a hyperventilation about 1.65 times because of peripheral chemoreceptors, and while we are expelling the carbon dioxide, it is causing respiratory alkalosis, which is compensated by the kidney, and further because of that compensation, the central chemoreceptor and the peripheral chemoreceptor together, they will stimulate the respiratory centers to have nearly 5 times the pulmonary ventilation. Okay, this is the one of the very important change in the acclimatization. Okay, now the second very important change what we see in our body is increase in the RBC and increase in the hemoglobin level. Okay, increase in the RBC, it is called as polycythemia and increase in the hemoglobin content. So you know, generally the hemoglobin content is around 15 gram percentage per deciliter, that is it will increase to around 20 grams per deciliter. How it occurs, how it happens? So okay, so due to the hypoxia there are certain things, something known as hypoxia inducible factor, hypoxic inducible transcription factors. Okay, so mainly in the kidney these are present. So this in the kidney, these hypoxic inducible factors, transcription factors, they will stimulate the interstitial cells, fibroblast cells, which are near the peritubular capillaries. Okay, so that will stimulate the production of one very important protein, that is glycoprotein known as erythropoietin. Okay, erythropoietin. So erythropoietin is secreted mainly by the kidneys and also by the other tissues. Okay, so this erythropoietin is mainly produced by the kidney and by the other tissues like liver. So from the interstitial cells near the peritubular capillaries, they produce this erythropoietin, and this erythropoietin will stimulate the bone marrow, and from the bone marrow ultimately it will causes the increase in the RBC and hemoglobin production. And not only the RBC and hemoglobin production, the hematocrit will increase, and there is increase in the blood volume too. Around 30 to 40% of the blood volume is total blood volume is also increased. So increase in the blood volume is also seen. So increase in the blood volume. So what are the changes in the blood? Increase in the RBC, increase in the hemoglobin, increase in the hematocrit value, and ultimately increase in the total blood volume. Now because of this increase in the RBC count and hemoglobin count, more efficiently oxygen is carried. It is the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood is increased because of the more oxygen transporter. What are the oxygen transporters? Hemoglobin and RBCs. Okay, so hemoglobin are more means it will carry the more oxygen. So when the available oxygen is less, so our body will try to compensate so that whatever available oxygen is there, let us supply more to the tissues. Okay, so one next compensating mechanism is polycythemia or increase in the RBC count. Then thirdly, what will happen is there is increase in the diffusion capacity or diffusion of oxygen, increase in the diffusion of the oxygen across the respiratory membrane, increase in the diffusion capacity of oxygen across the respiratory membrane. What do you mean by this increase in the diffusion capacity is, again I'll draw a rough diagram of the lungs to explain this thing. So you know, lungs and alveoli are there. So from this there are pulmonary vasculature. So oxygen will ultimately come from the alveoli and it gets transported into this across the respiratory membrane. So normally around 21 ml per millimeter of mercury per minute is the normal diffusion capacity of the oxygen across the respiratory membrane. Okay, now this diffusion capacity, it is increased at high altitude. So how come this diffusion capacity of the oxygen is increased? What are the mechanism? So mechanism is, there are two important mechanisms for this is, you know, due to hyperventilation, more amount of the air gets accumulated in this alveoli, and because of the more amount of the air which gets accumulated in this alveoli, this one respiratory this it will get expanded, is alveoli will get expanded because of the increase in the surface area of this alveoli. One reason, the more diffusion. Simultaneously, because of the increase in the blood volume, we have discussed just now, the blood volume is also increased. So because of the more blood volume which gets accumulated in the pulmonary circulation, it will again causes the capillaries to distend, and ultimately what will happen is the surface area of these capillaries will increase. So this together, both the factors, increase surface area here in this capillary level and the surface area of the alveoli, will causes more surface area, means more diffusion capacity. So more diffusion capacity is increased, that is oxygen level is less in the alveoli. So whatever it is there, let us more to be extracted into the blood and ultimately to the cells. Okay, this is the third important factor. The fourth important change what is taken place during the acclimatization or adjustment to high altitude is there is increase in the tissue capillarity. Increase in the tissue capillarity. You know, capillaries are there, right? Capillarity, or it can be said as there is angiogenesis. Angiogenesis means formation of the new blood vessels, simply. Okay, now you can consider this any systemic cell, and the transport of the gases takes place at the level of the capillaries, right? So if suppose there is a one capillary which is supplying the cell, so for this one, from this oxygen will enter from this capillary into the cell, right? When the oxygen level is less, the endothelial cells of these capillaries, they will get stimulated. Okay, they will get stimulated again by this one, hypoxic inducible factors or hypoxic inducible transcription factors. What they will do is they will stimulate the production of one protein that is known as vascular endothelial growth factors, and because of that, new capillaries, that is increase in the tissue capillaries, new capillaries are formed across the cells and the tissues. Because of the formation of the new capillaries, now more amount of the oxygen can be delivered to the cells because of the increased tissue capillarity. Okay, again the mechanism is due to this only, hypoxic inducible transcription factors. Okay, so this is the fourth important point. And finally, at the cellular level also some changes takes place to extract more oxygen. Okay, to use more oxygen from the blood. So what changes taken place is increase in the mitochondria and as well as increase in the cellular enzymes. Increase in the mitochondria and increase in the cellular enzymes take place. That is, the process of oxidative phosphorylation is accelerated. That is increased utilization of the oxygen at the cellular level. Okay, again it is due to this hypoxic inducible factors. They will form the new proteins so that new mitochondria, more amount of the mitochondria is produced. Okay, so these are the changes that takes place at the high altitude, and that changes it is known as simply acclimatization. Just to summarize, what is acclimatization? It is the adaptation or adjustment or physiological changes of our body at high altitude. Certain changes takes place at high altitude. First is the increase in the pulmonary ventilation, that is rate and depth of the breathing. It is there for up to 5 times the pulmonary ventilation is increased. Then we have explained the mechanism. Then there will be increase in the RBC count and the total hemoglobin level and the blood volume. Then there is increase in the diffusion capacity of the oxygen. Then increase in the tissue capillarity. Also the cardiac output is also increased, around 30% cardiac output is also increased. Okay, tissue capillarity and cardiac output is increased, and the cellular level increase in the mitochondria and cellular enzymes. Okay, so these are the changes that takes place and that is known as acclimatization. Okay, again, people who are staying there for a longer time or born and brought up there at the high altitude, certain changes are there physiologically in their body. For example, they will have a larger chest. Okay, because of hyperventilation, the chest cavity is larger inside. It is known as barrel shaped chest as compared to the body size. The body size will be normal, but chest will be larger. And the right side of the heart, okay, that is the right ventricle and the right atrium, the right side is be very strong because they have to pump the blood in the pulmonary circulation. Okay, so that are the changes that takes place. Then the next topic is acute mountain sickness and the chronic mountain sickness. We'll discuss in the next coming video. So stay tuned with us and subscribe our channel Doctor's Corner. Thanks for watching it. Please share and subscribe it.